front. Oh, just a bit. So, how many of you have seen the government lease form, the new one? Okay, if you haven't, I've got it in my new landlord guide. But how many of you have seen it? What is the first thing you notice when you read it? What do you notice?
Very long.
Very short. Very short. It's a few pages. I spoke to 700 investors 2 weeks ago who invest in residential units. And they were fuming when they saw this form. Why were they fuming? What do you think? Because it didn't have all their illegal clauses. They were miserable. But where's all my clauses? Where do I put them in here? Because what you don't know is that 90% of all residential leases out there are not legal. The good news is most tenants don't know that. So they pay. But that doesn't make them legal. So, example, the tenant will pay $100 and a set charge for every bounce check. Illegal. You can only charge $20. Tenant will pay the first $75 of every repair. No. Landlord has to pay for repair. So these landlords hated this. So I was able to calm them down a little bit, and I'll explain why as we go through it. So, AREA comes out and says you must use this after April 30th of this year. That's what it says. You must use this after April 30th, but that's not quite what it's used. So, right now, the offer to lease, they said they're going to make changes. Because as you know, in the offer to lease, it says if a lease is not signed, this offer shall be the lease. Yeah. Well, that seems to conflict with what about signing the new lease? Yeah. So there's two ways that they'll be able to deal with it. Either they'll put something like this together, that the parties agree to sign the new government lease form using the terms of this agreement to lease. So they could put that. So that means you take whatever the rent terms and everything else in your offer, and you just stick it in to into the new government lease, and any additional clauses that are not in the government lease, you attach as a schedule. So you could do that. Or you could just sign the new government lease right away and still add clauses if you want to. They allow you to add clauses, but what they say is they can't be illegal. So that's what they're telling you, but now let's look at the law. The law says if the tenant asks for the new lease after May 1st and you don't give it to them, they can withhold 1 month's rent. So there's a penalty. Furthermore, if you don't give it, they can cancel the lease on 60 days notice. So if they've signed the lease after April 30th, and then they want the new one and you don't give it to them, even if that lease is for a year, they can cancel it on 60 days notice. So what does that mean in English? If they don't ask for it, you can still use your current listing. Oh, the landlords, those investors, they were so happy. And I said, you can use your lease. As illegal as it is, but if the tenant asks you in writing, I want the new lease, well, then you got to give it. Oh, now they were thrilled. You know, and they're hoping most people won't understand the rules. So those are the rules. Now you're going to have to decide, what are you going to do? Are you going to use the original lease? What are you not? So we have clauses. So I have my own smoking clause, and this is it. So this clause covers, you can take a picture if you want, it's in my landlord guide, but it forbids smoking, marijuana, growing marijuana plants, and then somebody talked to me about electronic cigarettes. So what the hell do I know? Vapors, so I stuck it in there as well. Every kind of cigarette, you can't smoke. So what does that mean after the summer when the people are allowed to smoke marijuana? You can't throw somebody out for smoking, but you can if that smoke is bothering other tenants. And you can if it's damaging the property. So by having this clause in, if the tenant violates, and you can prove that they are bothering somebody else or damaging the place, it's easier to do an eviction. And so they didn't say you couldn't put this clause in. It's a legitimate clause, and I recommend you attach it to any lease, whether it's your own lease or the government lease. You attach it as a scheme. You just attach blank pages. There's another problem with the government lease, and they say you can only charge last month's rent. They forgot about first.
Oh.
So they're thinking, well, before you give the keys, you'll ask for the first month's rent. But they forgot that realtors have to pay commission with HST. And last month's rent doesn't include HST. So that's a problem. So I've done a first and last month's rent clause that you should attach as a schedule. Deposit equal to 2 months' rent is due at the time of acceptance of this lease by the landlord to be applied to the first and last month's rent due under this. In my experience, I don't care what the government lease says, nobody's going to complain for this. Tenants know they got to pay first and last month, and so they shouldn't be a problem. There's an issue about paying rent up front. How many of you have tenants who offer a year's rent up front in a bidding war? So I wrote in my landlord guide, you may have heard me say this before. As long as the tenant offers it, and you don't ask for it, it's legal. So if it's a bidding war, you have proof it's a bidding war. Tenant puts it in the lease, you didn't ask for it. What does ask for it mean? No text, no email, nothing that says, well, if you thought about it, you understand? Because this decision was made by a court of 3 judges higher than the landlord and tenant board of adjudicators. They hate this case. You can imagine. So when they get this issue, many times they'll say, yeah, the tenant offered it, but we think the landlord asked them. So because we think the landlord asked them, you got to pay it back, and you got to pay a penalty. So it's not that you just pay it back, you also got to pay a penalty. So when people ask me this question, lots of times I'm asking, who's the tenant who's making the offer? And most of the time, you know, if it's a student, foreign student, it's like they don't want to make trouble. They just want to pay. They're not making any trouble with the landlord, just to create grief. They want the rent paid. But you have to think about that. You have to be careful. If it's a bidding war for sure, and the tenant offers it, you have nothing in writing, you have a very good chance that even if the tenant goes after you, you'll be able to win that case. But be careful, okay? I'm not going to stand here and just say it's an automatic, because the board has been difficult with this, because they don't like it. They're very left-wing. They don't like this. They'll do anything to protect the tenant. Okay, so the maximum you can raise the rent this year is 1.8%. Doesn't matter what the unit is, 1.8%, you have to give 90 days notice. That's what you can raise the rent this year. The only exception is if the tenant leaves voluntarily. And so you'll learn the only way to get rid of the tenant legally, you've got to pay them to get out. Simple as that. It's a check. And the check gets higher every month because there's no place for them to move to. That's a real problem, is that the vacancy rate is so low. This is a war. Getting rid of tenants is a war, but the only legal way, generally, is to pay them to leave. And so how do you pay them to leave? Is find them another place to live. That's the way. If you can find them another place to live, my formula is pay them the difference in rent for 1 year. So if you're paying you $2,000 and $2,200 in a new place, pay the $200 for a year plus moving costs. That's my formula to pay them. And hopefully it'll work. Hopefully it'll work. But otherwise, it doesn't. There's another new section that came out 18 months ago that if a tenant has a 1-year lease, but they claim, no proof, that they are being abused by either somebody they're living with or somebody who's outside the unit, they can cancel the lease on 28 days notice and just walk out. So, and I've been told by paralegals, they've seen this at the landlord and tenant board, and judges have approved it. So that's also, most landlords don't know that, but that is the law. Okay, so now we're going to come to the only legal way to take a property back from a tenant, and that is it's for your family. So family means your parents, your kids, or your spouse. That's it. It's a very narrow family. So you have to give 60 days notice, and it has to be at the end of the term. So what does that mean? If a tenant has a lease till November 30th this year, and you want it for your kid, you can't kick them out before November 30th. So it has to take effect at the end end of the lease. Let's say it was a monthly tenant who pays by the month. You just count ahead 2 months, March, April, May, at the end of the month. So it would be May 31st would be the termination date today if it was a monthly tenancy. They changed the law last September. You got to pay 1 month's compensation to the tenant to do this. So if you're going to kick the tenant out for this reason, not only do you have to give them 60 days notice, you have to pay them a penalty of a month. So that's number one. 2, the family member must occupy for a minimum of 12 months. So let's say you gave notice end of May. Your kid would have to stay there till the end of May next year, or the penalty is $25,000 plus whatever the tenant costs were. So if the tenant had to pay extra moving and rent, they could sue the landlord for those extra costs. That's if the landlord is lying. This is now the #1 reason for eviction at the board. I read the Globe and Mail. What does that tell me? Landlords are on the warpath trying to trick tenants into leaving so they can double the rent or sell the place without tenants. And this is the only reason that makes sense to them, but they're lying because they have no intention of staying there for a year, and this is what the board is dealing with almost every day. And you understand why now, because there is no other way to terminate other than this. Okay, so now let's say you're selling a house and there's a tenant. So you have 2 kinds of buyers. Either the buyer is going to assume that tenant, like a condo, they assume the tenant, they buy it as an investment, and they just say, whoever the tenant is, we'll assume. Or they say, no, we want to move in on closing, which means you're going to have to evict the tenant because we want to move in on closing. So you have 2 kinds of buyers. If it's a buyer who says, no, I want the tenant out so I can rent it for more money, that's not possible. That's not possible. The only way that's possible is if you put in the offer, landlord will provide vacant possession, period. We're not moving in, we want vacant possession. That would force the seller to pay the tenant to leave. And if the offer price is good enough, before you accept it, you say to the landlord, go talk to the tenant, maybe you can make a deal. But that would be the only way the buyer could get the property empty and put in their own tenant. They're just asking for vacant possession and they're not moving in. Then the seller has to pay this person to leave. Okay, let's say the buyer says to you, we want to move in. So now we have to do an eviction. The good news is there's no penalty. So there's no 1 month penalty for this reason that the buyer is moving in. It's only if you're taking it back for your family. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. That's the rule. And I've given you the clause that you're going to put into your contract. It also comes from my landlord guide, but I've given it to you as well. So I'm going to slowly take you through this. So what this means is as follows. So the buyer is saying, we're moving in on closing, which let's say the closing date is May 31st, because we have to put the closing date to pretty much match the eviction date, because we know we have to give the tenant 60 days notice. Then the seller says they're going to give the 60 days notice using N12. That's the form you have to give on behalf of the buyer. But it's still coming from the seller. That's important. The buyer agrees to provide whatever support may be required to demonstrate that the buyer or their immediate family will, in good faith, will be moving into the property on closing, and to indemnify the seller for any damages the seller suffer if the buyer does not remain in the property for 1 year after closing. Remember, there'll be a penalty to pay if the buyer is doing this to trick so they can double the rent after closing. So that's what that means. And it goes on to say we'll extend the deal for 30 days if the tenant has not left. But then it says if the tenant has still not left, well, here you're going to have to figure it out. I put down the buyer can either accept the tenant or cancel the deal. You understand? Or you can, many buyers do not want to close if the tenant is fighting and they don't know if it's going to be damaged, and then if you can't extend too far because you lose the mortgage commitment. So you're going to have to figure out the end. But you understand the concept. So that's the clause. And now let me give you some examples.